So I think we can get started. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Trevor Timm. I'm the executive director here at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and welcome to our inaugural members only exclusive talk. We're going to be doing these for our Freedom of the Press Foundation members fairly regularly over the next year. And we are so privileged and honored to have actually one of our co-founders and the legendary Pentagon Papers whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, with us today, who's coming live from Berkeley, California. And it's going to be an hour where we can talk about leaks, where we can talk about government secrecy, we can talk about press freedom. Today is World Press Freedom Day, after all. And we get to have the privilege of getting Dan's unique experience and perspective on all current events. Before we start, this event is for members, so you have already graciously donated to Freedom of the Press Foundation, so thank you so much. Please pass along our website to anybody who you would think would like to join these events in the future. We're hopefully going to be able to put this one up online in a couple weeks, but many of them might not go online at all. So definitely let your friends and family know. But so without further ado, Dan, welcome and thank you so much for doing this. Today of all days, it's very interesting to have you on because as you and probably everybody saw late last night, one of the most significant leaks in recent history has occurred. Politico published an unpublished Supreme Court opinion written by Justice Alito, which purports to potentially overturn Roe v. Wade and has caused a firestorm in the political world and around the country. And so I would love to just get your general thoughts on the significance of this leak and the significance of leaks in general to democracy.
Well, thank you. First, let me welcome as a board member, along with you, Trevor, the people who are listening to this, especially the small funders representing, a large, I hope potentially growing and large mass of supporters of this Freedom of the Press Foundation. So I'm really glad to be addressing you. On this, Trevor, it occurs to me, first, you have the advantage of being on the East Coast. I think you have heard more about this than I have yet. I was reading the press edition of the West Coast edition of the New York Times now. It's not in there, and so I'm not as up on the controversy as you are probably. But I'm happy to comment, give you my initial reactions to it. It appears to be an unprecedented leak of a total opinion, and even though it's a draft opinion, and justices can change their position up until the last moment, till it's published. And that is supposed to be in late June. So we have some real time here for public discussion of it. And let me ask this. I'm talking now to Trevor. You're as knowledgeable about the laws on information and leaking and everything as I am, and I put it that way because that's the one part of the law that I am conversant with, literally, having been a defendant. So I come, the first defendant actually, under the Espionage Act. So I come to this from the point of view, not of a lawyer, but of a defendant and a whistleblower. And since you're a lawyer and a total supporter of whistleblowers, I want to ask you, what's your reaction to the situation?
Well, you know what, there is, with your case, there is this interesting parallel here. Obviously, your case involved the Pentagon Papers, the top secret study that was classified by the United States government, and they were able to charge you under the Espionage Act before your case was dismissed for misconduct. But correct me if I'm wrong, they also charged you under 18 USC 641, which is the law around theft of government property.
And conspiracy, also conspiracy to defraud the government, defraud them of their supposedly legal, or though not supported in explicit law, right to classify information. And I was frustrating that. Certainly I did. I really was very struck when I found myself I was charged with defrauding, because I thought what I'm doing is revealing truth here about lies and criminality. But apparently the government's, as I say, unsupported by law, but their function of keeping secrets, even about lies and crimes and aggression, is something that they are entitled to protect. And that's us I had gone against. So we have perhaps conspiracy, if there was more than one person involved, could be charged here. And as you say, the theft, conversion. And when you say that they were able to use the Espionage Act, that was an experiment in my case. It never had been used for that, on the assumption that it was unconstitutional under the First Amendment, that to hold a criminal to reveal any secret that some government official had stamped private person, well, classified, confidential secret, top secret, was a crime and could be prosecuted. Under the Espionage Act, which had earlier than that had been used only against spies who had given information in secret to a foreign power, especially an enemy in time of war. And so it was an experiment to see if they could use the Espionage Act against me. The charges were dismissed because of government criminality against me. So that didn't determine the judicial basis of that. And really, there wasn't another case for years after that, more than a decade. The Supreme Court, as you know, Trevor, has never addressed the constitutionality of that application of the Espionage Act to this day, although there have been, especially since Obama, an increasing number of cases now. But they've all been settled either by copying a plea, by a deal to avoid being charged even greater charges. People have gone along with that even when they didn't feel they should, but they couldn't afford to pursue the case anymore. And I only know of one case that was actually appealed up to the Supreme Court, the Morrison case, where they denied, they didn't hear it. There may have been another by now, I'm not sure, do you know? But anyway, I'm just want to make the point that the constitutionality of this prosecution has not been even addressed by the Supreme Court, let alone settled. And I have the impression, as a defendant here, talking to lawyers, that in my day, 50 years ago, in 1971, 73, a Supreme Court very well might have, or would have even likely, denied constitutionality of this use of the Espionage Act. That's far from the case today. And with the new Supreme Court, I wouldn't want to count on it at all. I think the odds would be against me. And of course, this applies to Julian Assange, which we'll probably come back to, who would be the first journalist, if he's extradited, to be prosecuted under this. But anyway, I asked you a question, Trevor, and I've now given you a chance to think about your answer. So go ahead.
I love it. Well, I mean, the reason I brought up USC 641 is because, you know, there is a lot of outrage over this leak from especially right-wing circles this morning. Yet even with everybody claiming that this is a breach of confidentiality we've never seen, not a lot of people can point to a law in which this leaker potentially broke, because of course Supreme Court opinions aren't classified, and the Supreme Court justices or clerks don't sign large secrecy agreements like national security officials do. And so the one statute some people have pointed to is this stolen government property statute. Now, this also brings up First Amendment concerns, given that, it was also something that you were charged with. And many people think that information is not necessarily property. And so curious if this came up in your case and whether, you had given any thought to whether it's, a First Amendment violation to be gagging people with that statute.
But going on, can you say a little more about your reaction to both the leak and mainly the leak aspect of this in the case of the Supreme Court?
Well, as you said, there has never really been a case, whether it's the Espionage Act or any other case, that directly hinges on.
How about just the ethics as opposed to the legality or the appropriateness?
Well, I think as The ethics, as you well know, the ethics and the legality often do not match up. We've seen countless national security whistleblowers over the years who, in many cases, at least by what courts have been deciding for the past decade, are breaking the law when they leak to the press. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's an unethical decision, and often it can be a very ethical decision. It remains to be seen what the motivation of this leaker actually was. A lot of people are assuming that this leaker was somehow employed by some of the more liberal justices to potentially head off this opinion. But then in the New York Times just now, Adam Liptak was speculating that actually it's someone on the right-wing side of the court hoping to cement this opinion before anybody changes their mind. So it's hard to tell. And oftentimes, when we talk about the motives of the leaker, it often masks or hides the story that we should be talking about, which is the content of the leak. I'm sure you experienced this during your day, and Snowden did as well. And it often happens with these big leak cases where it turns into a motivation or personality contest versus what is actually being exposed.
Well, it's not clear to me that the ethics of this should depend so much on the precise motives of the leaker, because since it is accepted that this is not just a draft of one justice that's coming out here, it's a draft of a majority opinion, which may not continue to be a majority opinion through June, but he's writing for a majority supposedly in this, and it does seem to me a very good to have this up for public discussion in the remaining time before June, to have it instead of the country being presented with the fait accompli, which whether you like it or not, it's done, that's it. Here is a case where a justice who is not forbidden, as a jury is sometimes done, to read the public press, about the case, the judges now will be exposed to a variety of views on that opinion, most of which will be familiar because it's been such a long time debate. But they may hear some things here that they hadn't thought of in the course of this could actually change their opinion. And I think that would be all to the good. That would be serving the purpose of public discussion, which is on a major political matter, which is the basic or a basic function of the First Amendment, both freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So I would say this was an exemplary case of something being brought forward for public discussion. And whichever the purpose is, they revealed it. And it could be either way, as you said, the less obvious one being to cement some of the judges in their majority opinion, so they would have to be publicly reversing themselves in public if they did, in fact, change their opinion. So they want to head that off. But either way, I think it's good for us to hear this. And as you say, the legality of it is a big question. The government can't copyright information. And I presume that applies to the Supreme Court. Am I wrong? They can't copyright their drafts, I don't think. So you don't get this civil case of copyright violation. Have they written disclosure agreements? And what is the sanction for that exactly, other than firing? Non-disclosure agreements. I imagine they have actually, in some way, to some extent. It is striking how little we have ever learned of the internal conversations. As I remember, Scott Armstrong, who was an investigator for the Watergate Committee, did publish a book about the justices at one time that revealed a lot of internal discussion. And my memory is that was very unusual for us to learn. On the Supreme Court, as in the executive branch and as in Congress, there's a tremendous amount. You can always assume there is a divergence of opinion, that there is dissent, which the institution generally agrees to lie about and to deny that there was dissent, or at least to keep it secret. You don't have a right to know how we arrived at this decision, you being anybody outside the group. And that's true of groups in general, bureaucracies in general. We and they, we have, the world is divided into that. We have our secrets, our dirty laundry is not to be just, and that includes differences of opinion on this, so that when the opinion issues from the institution, it has the apparent authority of being unanimous or near unanimous, when that typically is not the case at all. And they're willing to lie about that greatly. And that happens every day in the government, that there's agreement on this. Every expert who has seen the data, or whether it's scientific or intelligence or classified data of something, everybody who sees that agrees that this is the right way. We trust us, take our word for that. That word is almost always a lie. People look at that same evidence, and some people see it one way and some another, both on the legitimacy and the appropriateness, of a particular program. So to maintain the mystique of the authority of these 9 people, they really have maintained very effective secrecy, so that when an opinion comes out, we do know the number of judges on one side. Sometimes there are dissenting opinions. But how about the arm twisting, the disagreements, the deals that were made behind the scene to get that majority? Keep that secret. No, this is from on high. This is Oz, the mighty and magnificent. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, as in Wizard of Oz. And so the Supreme Court does act like the Wizard of Oz, together, at least the majority does. Is that bad? Well, that's not easy to say. You can't say right and wrong. There are said to be hackers with a hacker philosophy that information demands to be free or wants to be free, and there should be total transparency about everything. And then if you pin them down, it turns out to be, well, not us, not our group is to be transparent, but government and maybe corporations should be transparent. You can't live with that. None of them really live up to that. And it's true that for a whole variety of reasons, rivalry, authority, enemies in some cases in war, secrecy is appropriate or legitimate, and not total transparency. In Congress, a very key aspect of that is there's a process in the Congress of their marking up bills, where they're making the deals and trading off, and so forth, and pretending to be of unanimous agreement for a majority on some issue. It would be good if we knew a lot more about that. It's the old expression, you don't want to know, or we don't want you to know, how sausage or legislation is made. It's just too repellent and delegitimizing. Well, if you want legislation, some secrecy serves a function. In the Supreme Court, it's obvious to get people to accept the judgments of these 9 people. Used to be all men, used to be all white. The authority that is controlling, they need all the authority they can get, so they do need an element of legislation, if that's an important function in our democracy. And I've never questioned that. I may be convinced that, like the Electoral College or like the Senate, 2 senators per state, I could be convinced that this is not that wonderful a function. But on the whole, in my life, I've accepted that. What has become plain, at least since 2000, is that when they say there are no Democrat and no Republican judges, I think Roberts has said that precisely. That's absurd. I mean, is he kidding? That's ridiculous. And we know more and more there are Republican judges and Democratic judges, and we can predict the decision on that. Well, that lowers the authority. There's no way around it. And is that a good thing or bad? It depends. On the whole, I've accepted the assumption that they're doing it the way it more or less has to be done. On the other hand, that has resulted in such terrible decisions in my lifetime that in some good ones in others where perhaps this would have undermined other decisions. Roe versus Wade, for example, in the beginning might not have been as effective as it was if there had been total transparency on that. You know, a decision you like, in other words. And so you can't say, I think, right and left here, good and bad, that it's clear. This seems to me to be a case where it's clear that it's good for public discussion to take place, not in the context of a fait accompli. And I say that even though every indication is that public discussion will not change this decision, and that Roe versus Wade, as predicted, is going to fall victim to the new conservative justices.
Well, speaking of wanting to spark discussion and fait accompli, you are obviously most well known as the whistleblower during the Pentagon Papers 50 years ago. I think many people may have missed, though, last year, you contacted another New York Times reporter, Charlie Savage, and actually handed over old classified documents from your time in the government about another issue that you felt needed to be talked about in the public consciousness a lot more than it was. And you even in this article encouraged or dared the Justice Department to prosecute you for leaking these classified docs. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that issue was and why you challenged the Justice Department to prosecute you all these years later.
Yeah, well, one interesting aspect of that is that in the light of the effort to extradite Julian Assange, who is pretty clearly a journalist, even though some journalists have questioned that. Bill Keller of the Times said, well, he's not a journalist the way I recognize. I think that was extremely self-serving, intending to ward off a prosecution of the Times. He said, no, he's who had published Assange's material. If Assange was guilty by every other standard, the New York Times is guilty. So Keller was saying, no, he's not a journalist. That's not a case that involves us. And unfortunately, until fairly recently, most of the press has acted that way, as if they are not under indictment right now. And the truth is that the Justice Department will make no distinction there that he was not a journalist. I mean, they might in some, if it served them in some particular context, they'd be willing to say anything. But in general, I think they will take the precedent of extraditing him and then prosecuting him as a solid precedent for prosecuting other journalists and publishers. He's more of a publisher than, let's say, a news reporter. He isn't a news reporter, but he is a publisher. And so Charlie Savage is as liable now to be prosecuted, if they wanted to, as Julian Assange, and they do not want to prosecute a New York Times reporter first if they have a choice. And they do have a choice here. They have Assange, who's a very controversial character for a number of reasons. So he's their preference. But Trevor, you're one of the very few persons, as someone who helped James Goodale on his book about the Pentagon Papers case, you're aware that Nixon had a grand jury looking into the indictment of Neil Sheehan and Hedrick Smith and other journalists on the Pentagon Papers. Hardly anyone knows that. And in fact, remember, grand juries are extremely secretive about their processes, effectively secret, so that they're very often used as tools of investigation in contexts where they shouldn't be. And that's why Chelsea Manning refused to testify in front of a grand jury, because to get her really to incriminate Julian Assange more than they had basis for. But she regarded grand juries as a generally undemocratic and an aspect of our system prone to abuse. And I think there's a good case for that. Tony Russo, who ended up as my co-defendant, his co-defendant in the Pentagon Papers case, he refused to testify in front of a grand jury against me and finally he changed that to say, unless he was given a transcript of his comments and the questions that he could publish, showing, for instance, what he had said and what he had not said, which many people in front of a grand jury would like to be known, lest it be thought that they had spilled the beans in a way they should not have. Okay, he was put in jail then for many weeks in contempt, and then finally they decided to indict him instead. Okay, so Nixon had that in mind way back, but people hardly know it, that such a effort was made against the press. So now we come up to this case where I was very open about it, to Charlie and others. And by the way the law is written, which shows its, I'd say, unquestionably unconstitutional aspect, the way the Espionage Act is written in current form, 18 U.S.C. 793, paragraphs D and E, the one bill I can roll off like that since I was the first person indicted under it for telling truths. So E applies to people who do not have authorized access and who do not, to this information, and who do not copy it, hold it, or present it to anyone else who's not authorized, other than an authorized person to keep these secrets, to whom this reader should deliver this information. That's every reader of the New York Times who holds that without presenting it to somebody who, well, that's hard to identify, shows it to their spouse or their children. Clearly a violation of the literal words of that paragraph. So it's absurd to say in a country that values free speech or investigative reporting at all, that that's regarded as not a violation of the First Amendment. It obviously is a violation. So, okay, so Charlie Savage, but he hasn't been indicted, nor have I. The issue was the insouciance, the casualness, the shallowness of the reasoning that led Eisenhower and his Joint Chiefs of Staff to prepare for, contemplate, threaten, plan contingently, blowing up the world pretty much. That's a metaphor. Let's be more specific. Using nuclear weapons against China, which could extend to Chinese cities as far north as Shanghai, in order to maintain control of a set of islands in those days, part of Taiwan's control, offshore islands, one of which is 1.5 miles from the Chinese mainland, MOA. And it was not only easily blockaded by artillery, you could see it. You can't quite throw a stone over there, but if you're standing on the mainland, you can see these islands. It's like in San Francisco Bay here, the islands I can see. And if Russia were claiming sovereignty, or China, over those islands against the U.S., let's see, eyebrows would be raised, or it would be war. That's right. So the Chinese were claiming right to take control of those. And there was no way to stop them other than to threaten to initiate nuclear war. The Joint Chiefs all agreed on that. And Eisenhower descended only to the point of saying, let's start with non-nuclear weapons against those Chinese air bases or artillery sites or whatever. Don't initiate. The Joint Chiefs were, especially the head of the Air Force, very opposed to that. It's going to go nuclear, so let's do it right away, and have the biggest effect. And that was accepted, that would lead to nuclear retaliation by China's ally, the Soviet Union. And it was regarded then already a little anachronistic as a Sino-Soviet bloc that was absolutely solid. And so that Khrushchev was expected by Eisenhower to carry out his commitment to treat an attack on China, however small, as an attack on the Soviet Union, and to respond, if it was nuclear, with their nuclear weapons. Now, in those days, it was really unlikely he would carry that out, but Eisenhower assumed he would. So Eisenhower was saying that if the Chinese continue their, this is in the top secret report, still top secret, these parts, about 3/4, 4/5 even, were declassified many years ago, I think in 77, sort of, but about 1/5 is not declassified, it's still top secret. And this is what I was putting out, and it is on my website, ellsberg.net. In fact, I sequestered the top secret pages for easy reading to see what they thought you should not know or the public should not know to this day. And that included this readiness even of Eisenhower to use nuclear weapons against China in the expectation that the Soviet Union would respond with nuclear weapons, not only annihilating Taiwan and the island, but Okinawa, or base in Okinawa, and even in Japan, conceivably on Guam, definitely. Well, what would be the answer to that? Eisenhower, I knew, as involved in nuclear war planning in that period, the answer to that would be a full-scale attack on the USSR and the satellites and China, hitting every city in China. And what they didn't know then, but we've known for 30 years now, since 1983, the effect of burning those cities would be to put hundreds of millions of tons of smoke and soot into the stratosphere where it would not rain out, quickly go around the globe and prevent entirely the globe, a little less in the south, 70% of sunlight. Freezing rivers and lakes if it was not winter already, but killing all harvests for much more than a year, possibly as long as a decade, starving nearly everyone to death. So had the Chinese continued what they were doing in the way of an artillery blockade of these offshore islands, if they continued to the point where we couldn't sustain those islands without military action, nuclear, you and I would not be having this talk. Our forebears, or we would, I was alive then, have starved to death half a century ago. So since the same exact issues are being raised now in the same exact area, now involving Taiwan, not just the offshore islands, which, by the way, Taiwan still claims to control of China. But the issue now is not the offshore islands, or it might be if they started that way. It's Taiwan. And if Biden continues what Obama started, but mainly Trump started, of treating representatives of Taiwan as if they were representatives of a sovereign nation, a nation which every leader of China since Mao has, and very much Xi right now, regards as a province of China, which really nobody disputed that until about 20 years ago in Taiwan. But Trump was the first president to accept a call at the White House level from the president of Taiwan. Now, is that the president of a province of China? He certainly doesn't get congratulations from any other province of China, or a move toward recognizing it as a sovereign state, like the congratulations he got from Putin or from everybody else. So, okay, he then got other high-level representatives in that fashion. We're trying to get them included in UN bodies as if they were an independent state. Biden is continuing to do that now. Pelosi was scheduled, but stopped by her COVID, from going to Taiwan. She would have been the first Speaker of the House with the same president party. Newt Gingrich actually did it once, but he was a Democratic president then. And so this would be national policy for her to go and treat them essentially as her head of state. She shouldn't do that because, again, it would be a step the Chinese have warned will lead to their invasion. And certainly almost all Chinese regard Taiwan and the mainland as part of China, and not as subject to secession, without any process here. Just as I understand nearly all Russians regard Crimea, without question, as part of Russia. So the Russian occupation of that has total support in Russia. Okay, so they've said this will lead to war. And the war would be, since we don't have the ability conventionally to defend Taiwan, conventionally alone, in most war games, we lose against the Chinese. So our commitment, as Biden puts it, we are rock solid behind defending Taiwan from use of force. That is a promise of blowing up not just the Northern Hemisphere population, but the world's population pretty much, because China too would involve nuclear winter. So I thought the fact still kept for the American people that our past presidents, who were not more stupid or reckless, talking about Eisenhower and Dulles here, than the present ones, or anybody we've had since then, were willing to prepare for and consciously to threaten and risk nuclear war with China and Russia. And back in 1958, the study was from 1966, but that too is over half a century ago. So when you say that I thought the public should know this, and I do think that, just as I've said that I think it was right to leak this opinion right now, which was not classified, but which has been held more effectively as non-disclosable, over the last centuries than most classified material. There hasn't been a leak like this, just as there, before the Pentagon Papers, had not been a leak of 7,000 pages of top secret material. By the way, not one sentence of which has ever been shown to justify being classified. Even at the time of 66 or later, they didn't declassify it officially till 40 years after my release, after I'd released it to everybody. It was officially declassified. And prior to that time, anyone handing it to anybody else would be as liable to prosecution under the words of the Espionage Act as I was. So, it was an anomalous situation here where the government claims this right to confine public knowledge of what it's doing behind the scenes, just as the Supreme Court does, to what they choose to release, to government handouts. And that means that all their lies and crimes, which you can be counted on in the national security so-called area, to be classified, I say so-called, because almost none of it has to do with American national security. Our national security, has not been at stake in any of the wars we have fought since 1945, any of them. And there have been a lot of it. So what is at stake? Well, other interests, which you could go into, but not national security.
Well, I think that brings up another point. And actually, I should point out to those attending right now, there is a Q&A button at the bottom right of your screen. If you want to type in a question, we can ask Dan after this last one. So today is World Press Freedom Day. And you've touched on it a little bit with the Julian Assange case. But I'm wondering if you could talk about why you believe that this is, and we believe at Freedom of the Press Foundation, that this is the most important press freedom issue in the United States. And, I wonder if you could also talk about this in regards to whether or not anybody actually likes Julian Assange. There are a lot of people that obviously have,
or me,
that may hate Julian Assange. And so, can you speak to that and why all journalists should be speaking out against this?
Yeah, well, I think I have been trying to put out the word for over 50 years since my case to journalists that they should familiarize themselves with the arguable, I would say, unconstitutionality of the Espionage Act used against sources such as me, because I've always said the wording of that applies to you just as much as to me. and can be used to, in effect, install government secrecy by threatening with prosecution any journalist who puts out information that the government doesn't want out. And there's a great range of that, and some of it has to do with national security, in a word. Maybe 5%, that's an estimate by a real expert on the subject. Maybe after a few years, said William Florence, who had written the classification statutes in the Department of Defense, and after he retired, he said, after a few years, 1/10 of that, half of 1%, deserves classification. So everybody agrees that there's over-classification, but what is that? 10%? 50%? How about 99% after a few years, or 95% at the time of classification? Hardly anybody really understands to what extent then this system is anti-democratic and gets us into the most costly of wars, including the possibility of nuclear war right now. The world should not be hostage to our policy over recognizing Taiwan, but it is. And that should be known to the public. And now we come to a disappointing aspect of the last 50 years. Will public knowledge of this really lead to change? Generally, there are vested interests that are so strong on this that public opinion doesn't really affect it very much, and it doesn't change. And I have to say that my hope that public information and the release at the risk of one's life in jail, or even just the loss of your job, is worth it in the sense that it will change the situation. We don't have much evidence of that. In fact, the Pentagon Papers themselves did not change Nixon's policy of making nuclear threats to North Vietnam and of pursuing the war. And a tremendous amount of tonnage, more than 1 million tons, more than half a World War II tonnage of high explosive, was dropped on North Vietnam after the Pentagon Papers came out. So that was disappointing to me that it didn't. What actually, the war would not have ended as an air war, even after the departure of American troops. The bombing would have been resumed and continued were it not for the fact that Nixon was removed from office. And that was something that nobody foresaw. I think literally no one, unless it was Nixon in dark moments. But he couldn't have believed it would actually happen. He knew he was subject to it. He knew he'd committed crimes. But would they be revealed? Would they be believed? Would there be political action on it? I think no one, literally no one, would have imagined that Nixon would be out of office in 74, after his landslide election in 72, which was a year after the Pentagon Papers, so they didn't hurt him politically. And it was after the revelations of Woodward and Bernstein and the Watergate revelation, so he got a landslide election. The war would be continuing perhaps still in the air as it continued for 20 years in Afghanistan without no longer American casualties. Just
well, can I
Afghan casualties. But
can I interrupt you there?
Well, I did reveal something else then. I revealed National Security Study Memorandum number 1 under Nixon, which Nixon knew about. Few Americans have heard of it to this day. That worried him that I had other documents, and that got him to commit crimes, which got him out of office. So it was not an accident, actually, that his Vietnam policy and the secrecy of it, because it included elements of nuclear threats that the American public would not have liked. And would the mere revelation have changed the policy? Not only is it not certain, it's not even likely in experience. And yet, the fear of that did lead him to make domestic crimes against an American citizen, me, including efforts to incapacitate me or kill me, which did, in fact, and it had an effect. So what I can say is, when the Freedom of the Press Foundation, with its secure drop and its encouragement of whistleblowing, makes possible a revelation by someone who otherwise would not have been willing to do it without doing it securely with secure drop, which we know. That's probably has encouraged a lot of whistleblowing. The likelihood that that would change effects is small, but it's not zero. And not only in my case, but in others. It takes, in effect, a lot of other people collaborating and acting and so forth. But whistleblowing can save lives and prevent wars and prevent changes in the Constitution that Ed Snowden was revealing, unconstitutional behavior in National Security Agency that was surveillance of all of us. Has that surveillance stopped or been reduced by Ed Snowden's taking an act that has made him a lifetime exile? Not clear. But was it worth him taking that chance and paying that price, which he's still paying and will pay? Or for Chelsea Manning to go to jail, and largely a lot of it in solitary confinement, for 7.5 years? I would say yes, it was worth it because so much was at stake. And right now with Taiwan, with these constitutional issues, so much is at stake. Of course it can be worth risking your own individual freedom. And the Freedom of the Press Foundation, in supporting the First Amendment here, practically, not just in rhetorically, but by making it somewhat safer for whistleblowers to reveal information they understand should be public, are not just maintaining the First Amendment, which will be shredded if Julian Assange is successfully prosecuted. And if he's indicted, he will be successfully prosecuted under all current experience. The press should be united in opposing that and revealing the unconstitutional nature, and they haven't shown that yet. But the Freedom of the Press Foundation can be expected absolutely to be in the forefront of that opposition. You personally, Trevor, I expect, to be writing eloquently on that subject and opposing it. And yes, that is worthwhile. So I thank all the donors, all the supporters of the Freedom of the Press Foundation that I'm addressing now. I think you're not only helping to keep this a free nation, a republic instead of an effective monarchy or dictatorship, but that in turn has shown can protect the world from wrongful wars or end them. And we haven't had much experience yet in actually preventing it. And we're seeing right now in Russia that shutting down an independent press has every prospect of maintaining that war indefinitely. And that is a prospect we should be doing everything, including risking people's lives, to prevent. The prospect of the press becoming no more free than it currently is this month in Russia.
Very well said, very well said. And actually, so you actually mentioned Edward Snowden, our friend Edward Snowden. And this brings us to our first audience question. What do you say to someone who thinks that you are a hero, but is critical of Edward Snowden or thinks Edward Snowden is a criminal? A lot of times, especially in the early days in 2013, 2014, you heard actually a lot of politicians say, oh, he's no Daniel Ellsberg, and never bothering to ask you that question. So curious what your thoughts are there.
Well, you and I know, Trevor, that you're talking about the chairman of our board, correct? Isn't that his title?
Of course.
Am I wrong? So Ed Snowden is our colleague and chairman. No, it's not only politicians and not only Republicans, but journalists who have made that point frequently. There's a big difference between. I tend to repress certain things. Okay, who's the New Yorker writer? Very popular journalist.
Malcolm Gladwell.
Gladwell, yeah, okay. I'm repress it here because I'm so angry at the article that he wrote, which, by the way, I wrote a letter refuting very delicately, very diplomatically, which didn't get printed by the New Yorker ever. complaining about his point that he ends this thing by saying Ed Snowden doesn't deserve to be in the same room with Daniel Ellsberg. I can say that I made the effort to go to Russia to be in the same room with Ed Snowden, who's not only a friend, but before I met him, someone I admired very much and appreciate and still do. So he's a hero of mine as well as a friend, which is a nice situation. He's not the only one. And the idea that there was, I recognize some difference in his motives or in being in exile instead of going to court. I point at the simple fact that in my day, I was released actually on my own recognizance at first, and then with a $50,000 bail, but to appear in court. But I was able during that time to address rallies, demonstrations, all kinds of webinar. Well, they didn't have webinars then, actually, but in person to address discussions of this. It was clear after, at some point earlier, but especially from the example of Chelsea Manning, who was held incommunicado at first and then in solitary confinement for 10.5 months, and never was able to talk to a journalist in the course of her trial. Never. And then, of course, put in prison. It was clear that he would not be able to speak to journalists, as I was 50 years ago, freely. He would be held totally incommunicado on the grounds that he knew many things higher than top secret, which he did, some of which he revealed, especially when they revealed criminal behavior, and some he didn't. A lot, he never has. And he left it up to the judgment of journalists, but it was essential for him to explain the content of what he was revealing in terms of acronyms, in terms of practices. He had to explain things to journalists in a way that I really didn't, because the Pentagon Papers is a narrative, 7,000 pages, that speaks for itself. In fact, looking back on it, to encourage people to read it, I tended to say, read for yourselves, don't ask me, what the meaning of this is. And I regret that in retrospect. It was to get them to read it, and they didn't. There was no way to get them to read it. So looking back, I should have put, my interpretation of the thing, made it available, even though I thought at the time that would discourage them from reading it, but that was wrong. Snowden had to explain stuff which was not self-evident to the journalists, so he had to be out of the country. And of course, he never intended to end up in Russia, but by taking away his passport in the course of his going to Latin America, some countries had offered him immunity at that, or political asylum, and he was stopped in the Russian airport from going on because they took away his passport. I noticed that today I mentioned in the obituary to Kathy Boudin that my lawyer was Leonard Boudin, her father, had defended Paul Robeson and Daniel Ellsberg. Well, the Robeson case was a passport case, as I recall, and Leonard had argued a number of passport issues. Well, he could take it away. Well, he would have been involved in the Snowden case, probably had he been alive. So that control of passports is another way of controlling speech. It was used in the Philip Agee case, for example, to hound Agee and make him almost the man without a country for most of the rest of his life. So, okay, the answer is I admired Snowden from the moment those issues came out. I said before he was identified by name that the person who revealed that was in danger of his or her life. And I said that as someone who had a precedent, Nixon, bring people up. By the way, this is a matter of a current series, a gaslit about Martha Mitchell, and mentioned at the beginning, the Pentagon Papers and the plumbers. Well, there was a case of where the so-called plumbers who had been involved in an effort to incapacitate me, which didn't happen because they felt they were being set up as fall guys, or as one of them put it, a Cuban Bay of Pigs veteran, like Oswald, rightly or not. But anyway, that was their perception, and I was to be incapacitated. And then they thought, no, they were going to be made patsies, like Oswald, who was shot by a mob figure, Jack Ruby. So they didn't want to be shot or jailed, so they backed off from it. And that's why I'm here. Anyway, I'm aware that presidents are willing to kill or incapacitate people who are about to say things or might bring documents out that they don't want. Not unlike Putin and Navalny, let's say, right now. When Trump said, when questioned whether his friend Putin was a murderer, he said, "What, you think we're so clean?" That was not an example of Trump's worst comments. And that's what we're trying to avoid here, an actual close down of information. So, in short, Gladwell's and others saying that there's all the world of difference between Snowden and me, wrong.
Very well said. So I think we only have a couple minutes left here, and we only have time for one more question. Feel free to keep this short if you'd like, Dan. I know.
Feel free.
I'm
almost constitutionally unable
You are
to
welcome to talk for as long as you want, but I know this question is really setting you up like it's T-ball here. So the question from the audience is, you talked about overclassification earlier. The question is, why is so much information overly classified? And how has that become the norm rather than the exception?
Okay. It's the norm for human groups to keep the secrets of the group from outsiders. And that's one of the most sweeping generalizations one could make and support. If there's anything more human, there aren't many things more human than that. But the government claims the right to put people in prison for breaking non-disclosure agreements. Corporations generally can't do that. They can just blackball you for life and deprive you of your career, like the whistleblowers who revealed secrets of tobacco corporations and the fact that they were consciously leading to the deaths of some 500,000 Americans a year, more than all Americans killed in all our wars except the Civil War every year. And the tobacco companies knew what they were doing and still know what they're doing, and so forth. So when that was revealed by Wellender and Williams and a few other people, they didn't face prison, but they faced total blackballing in their profession from then on, which is enough to keep the silence. There should be much more whistleblowing on corporations than there is, but as I say, the penalties are high there too. In the government case, they want to put you in prison for revealing their secrets. Now, I was saying to my wife, Patricia, this morning, recalling something she said in a conference once when she was going to be a speaker, and one of the earlier speakers was an anthropologist named Angie Arian, who had said that there were 4 fundamental taboos across all human experience, pretty much, that you find in every culture, against murder, incest, lying, and theft. And when Patricia came up, she said she was thinking about Angie's statement about these 4 fundamental taboos, and she about lying, murder, theft, and incest. And she said, except for incest, violating those taboos is what we call foreign policy. Mass murder, lying, theft, as we're theft of property and area. And that's true not just of Russia and Ukraine. It's true of the United States of America in Iraq, which is massive aggression and mass murder, still so far, and Afghanistan. Still so far, many more victims than the tens and even hundreds of thousands we've yet seen in Ukraine. And yet, if secret policies are continued in the U.S., or even the public policy that Austin has said of pursuing this to weaken Russia till they can't invade Georgia or Moldova in their neighboring countries like Ukraine, well, that's a recipe for how long? A century? A hell of a lot more than 10 years to achieve that. And if we're doing that at the expense of Ukrainian lives rather than negotiate, encourage the negotiate and support the negotiation of compromises on both sides, then we will see the kind of casualties that the Russians inflicted with our encouragement in Afghanistan. I say encouragement by supplying the Mujahideen that, however legitimately, were opposing Russian occupation. They were doing it at the usual cost of 10 Afghans dead to every, actually in this case, much more than that. The Russians lost 15,000 dead in a war which we wanted to encourage, as Brzezinski admitted. And later, 1.5 million Afghans killed, or 1 million, at least 1 million. Well, in Afghanistan, to encourage a guerrilla war by supplying it may be thoroughly legal and legitimate in the face of occupation and lethal to millions of Ukrainians. So the point being that governments all the time, not only the American government, but imperial governments in particular, always have lies and crimes and murders to keep secret from their own people. And without whistleblowing, which varies in risk in different countries. In Russia, as I've just said, more than once has led to death for the journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, for example. And in China, which leads to incarceration for life, very generally. In U.S., not so much yet, though growing in terms of risk. And not without risk of death, even as we've seen, as I've talked about. But not much of that yet, not as much as in Russia or China or North Korea, where it's a sure recipe for death. Or Colombia, where journalists exposing the drug trade have been killed very widely. In this country, not yet. But the motives are the same for keeping government secrets, not just from enemies, but mainly from their own people and the world opinion. And the risks are less, and yet the stakes are just as high as they could be. The stakes are everything. Everything is at stake. At the possibility of nuclear war, which we're seeing as a rising possibility right now over the last 2 months. And by the way, it is Putin who has raised that prospect more than anyone else in this situation. In Taiwan, it will be the U.S. who raises it. Where there's a local, the other side has a more conventional force. In this case, it's Putin. In both cases, outrageous, evil in terms of raising that risk to a degree that human society never envisioned before, because the stakes of destroying most humanity were never feasible for any leader before. And they have been feasible for governments in the last 70 years, led by the U.S. and then by Russia and others. So the reasons for whistleblowing are greater than they've ever been before. The risks, about the same in most countries. In this country, less, but getting worse. So the prospect of changing that in the direction of our First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of the press, everything depends on it. Obviously, a lot is at stake in the abortion issue here. A lot of women's lives are at stake. And on the other side, people see the rights as they see them of fetuses or, great stakes. They are big on both sides. And a decision which has been revealed now is likely of illegalizing, criminalizing abortion is not going to reduce abortions that much. So it isn't going to affect fetuses or embryos all that much. It's going to affect people, poor people in states that have banned abortion, who will risk their freedom or simply can't afford to move to other states and so forth. Poor people, minorities and so forth. But I say all that, obviously, not to minimize those risks, but to compare them with what's at stake with the possibility of nuclear war. Everybody. Does that make a difference? Well, it should make a difference in a willingness, I think, to lower that risk by telling the truth. And the Freedom of the Press Foundation and its donors are on the side of making such decisions more open to public understanding, knowledge, and debate. And I believe that's the right side to be on. It's the side I am on, and then Snowden and Trevor Timm are on, and all the members of the board and the staff of the Freedom of Information, the Press Foundation, and the donors. And the day could come when your donations involve risk, very frankly. And it might not be that far off. Let's be open about that. Republican Congress, another Republican president, whether it's Trump or not, frankly, let's be fair, let's be quite frank. The safety of a donor to the Freedom of the Press Foundation could be as much at risk as the donors to my trial were at risk. And there were 25,000 of those, and they knew it. And there were people who didn't want their names on a check who were very sympathetic to me at that time. And the people who helped me essentially put out the press, put out the Pentagon Papers, were not willing to be identified in my book, Secrets, when I told the story, as I hoped they would be to tell the story, because Ashcroft was the Attorney General, essentially a Confederate Attorney General at that time, as so many Trump supporters are right now. So that's not some past concern. A couple of them are now willing to be identified, or were willing under Obama to be identified more recently, like Gar Alperovitz, Janaki Chanarl, and someone who feared being deported. I think she's in India now, as recently as that, but who just revealed themselves as having been crucial to that 50 years later. And there are others who definitely are not willing to be identified by me to tell that story of how they helped me put out the Pentagon Papers. Yeah, and I appreciate their motives for doing that. So there's a struggle going on for freedom of the press, and this foundation is at the vanguard of it.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for your leadership here at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and thank you for joining us today. It's been an incredibly illuminating conversation, and I'm sorry to the folks whose questions we did not get to, but I promise we'll invite Dan back, hopefully in a few months. And if you show up, I promise we can get him in first thing. So Dan, it's so great to see you in great health and great spirits, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you for the opportunity, Trevor.
All right, take care, everybody, and stay tuned for our next membership event, which should be coming to your email inboxes in the next month or two. Take care.